ハンフォード核施設で製造されたプルトニウムによる放射性硬化物の被害を受けた方々の証言や、被爆をめぐる被害者たちの法的な戦いについて書かれています。ハンフォード核施設とは何か改めて教えてください。
Hanford site was a massive, secretive plutonium production site, federal site in Washington state. So that's in the northwest corner of the United States. And it's on the Columbia River. And it started up in late 1944 and continued, produced plutonium for the Manhattan Project, and then continued to produce plutonium throughout the decades of the Cold War. And throughout that entire time, the site secretly released airborne radionuclides all across Washington, eastern Washington, Idaho, into western Montana, northern Oregon, and it went also into British Columbia. No one knew about this other than the plant operators, but and so there were a lot of chemical separations plants, and that's where all the radiation came from. And they also dumped solid and liquid radionuclides into the Columbia River. So it impacted communities all the way from the Hanford site to the Pacific.
ご自身の被爆体験について書かれています。改めてどのようにトリシャさんが被爆してしまったのか教えてください。
I was born and raised downwind of Hanford. I lived in the city of Richland, which is the city where all the scientific workers lived. There were construction workers across the river in Pasco and some in Kennewick, but Richland was sort of the exclusive home of chemists, engineers, and their families. And so my exposure started around 5 months when I was still in utero, because at 5 months, radioiodine and some of the other radionuclides can cross the placental barrier. So children are exposed even before they're born. And then when I was born, I have birth defects in the knee joints, which that's why I'm right now unable to walk. I'm going to have operations on them, but genetic malformations. And there were, when I was growing up, I drank a lot of milk, as did many other, all kids pretty much. Most children were not breastfed back then in the 1950s, so we drank a lot of milk. And the milk had taken radioactive iodine from the air, which had fallen on the pasture grass, and then the cows and goats consumed that grass, and the radioiodine went into the milk. That was known from the 1940s. I talked about this in the book. Scientists knew that, first of all, radioactive iodine can harm the thyroid. And then they learned from experiments at the Hanford animal farm on sheep that a lot of the radioiodine that they took in went into the milk. So it was known at the time that children would be drinking this milk and getting the radioactive iodine into their bodies, and then that would be taken up by the thyroid of the child. So my thyroid stopped growing when I was very small. So it was very small, and then it started to destroy itself through an autoimmune process, Hashimoto's, also known as Hashimoto's disease. So that was one route of exposure, the milk pathway. But there were many other radionuclides that are harmful that were let out of Hanford's separations plant stacks. And there hasn't really been thorough study of what those radionuclides did to children or adults. Most of the study, in fact, at Hanford, was on radioactive iodine, which is also a substance that came out of the Fukushima nuclear reactor accident, came out of 3 Mile Island, out of the Chernobyl reactor accident, and was in fallout from Nevada test site tests and also in the Marshall Islands. So it's a common radionuclide that can cause thyroid disease, thyroid cancer. So there's the airborne, then there's also exposure from the water of the Columbia, because I would go swimming there a lot, and my family had a boat. We go up and down the river. A lot of the people, scientists working at Hanford, were retired Navy, and So they had little boats and they liked to go up and down the river. And we swam a lot in the river. And it's known that there were radionuclides, now known that their radionuclides were dumped into the river. So I don't know what my exposure was from that. And there was also radiation and fallout that landed on produce, like gardens, produce, and a lot of the meat was contaminated because the steer, the cows, etc., or a lot of the animals that were slaughtered were consuming contaminated pasture grass. And in fact, the Hanford operators went frequently to the slaughterhouse in Pasco to collect the thyroids of the animals and other organs because they were measuring those organs for radioactive content. So we know they were aware of it, even though we were all living there, getting exposed every day. It was you have to look at cumulative exposure. It was low dose cumulative exposure, which adds up. So it's no longer very low dose after months and months, especially if you're a little kid, when you're very vulnerable to it.
ご本の中で24人の被爆者の証言を紹介されています。どのようにして証言者たちと出会い、取材をしていったのでしょうか。
I had met people ever since I started working in 1988 on Hanford issues. I met other people who were sick, and they found out I was working on the issues, and I'm an attorney, so they would often come to me and just, talk to me about what to do next. And so I met people over the years, 30, 40 years of my work on the subject, who had other cancers that were not thyroid cancers, who had lupus or multiple sclerosis, many with thyroid cancer. And it wasn't until 1990 that the litigation was filed. But then for the plaintiffs that I interviewed for this book, the only way I could reach them was because of privacy considerations, was to ask the attorneys whether they would send a letter out from me to their clients when they sent out final settlement checks. So that's how I was able to contact the people in the book. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had a means by which to contact them. There's so much time has passed since people learned about Hanford in 1986 that a lot of people have died. Some have moved away. It's very hard to find downwinders nowadays.
それぞれの方の証言はいずれも衝撃的ですが、特に印象に残る証言はありますか？
Well, every story in the book strongly impacted me. I'm one of the stories in the book. My mother is also a story, and I mentioned what happened to my father. So I'm not shocked by the gravity of it because I've been through it myself. But every story is different. What really shocked me, though, was that a lot of the people who received treatment, especially in the 70s or 80s for thyroid cancer, had very harsh treatments with radiation and chemotherapy. And yet, in spite of all the damage from these treatments, which included ankylosing spondylitis, where your spine fuses, another person had a lot of problems with his jaw after the surgery. But in addition to that, the cancer would remain sometimes in the body because it had already metastasized by the time it was found. So these people, in spite of going through all this, and despite becoming disabled from their treatments themselves, have to worry for the rest of their lives about cancer returning. My father died of aggressive thyroid cancer, so I saw it in its worst manifestation. It just exploded into aggressive thyroid cancer, went all over his body, into his brain, lungs, and essentially killed him in spite of radiation and chemo treatment. I feel the government, our US government, could easily have apologized, at least, to all of us who were injured. And if they'd funded medical care and monitoring for all of us, and also the people who lived in the shadow of other production sites and testing sites and the Marshall Islands, that would have cost them a lot less than the litigation did defending against our claims, and it would have gone a long ways to helping us heal. Right now, we're all just trying to live with the effects of this by ourselves.
鼻血、甲状腺の問題、麻痺、様々なタイプの発がん、肉体の奇形化など、被害者の被爆による影響には様々なタイプがありますが、多くの方が同じ症状を語っています。被爆すると人体にどのような影響が出るのでしょうか。
You know, I feel that looking at the Fukushima Daiichi exposed children is a great illustration of what happened to us too. When you're exposed to low dose ionizing radiation, there's a period of time, it could be a few years, it could be longer, before you experience the first symptoms of disease. In the case of the Fukushima Daiichi downwinders, you can see the children already, over 260 or so children have been diagnosed with thyroid cancer from the radioactive iodine. That's not a surprise, and we saw nosebleeds. Many kids had nosebleeds in Richland, and I had them. Many of the people in the stories I wrote about had them. That's one of the telltale signs of having been exposed to radiation. You can see this in much literature. Also, the other cancers that came from the river and the other radionuclides and autoimmune diseases, which are, because many of us had Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune disease. Excuse me. This opened the door to more autoimmune diseases. Once you have one autoimmune disease, you're more susceptible to others. And if you see the stories in the book, you see people with thyroid cancer or autoimmune thyroiditis, then asthma, then lupus and MS, a combination oftentimes. In my case, excuse me, in my mother's case, my mother had autoimmune thyroiditis, and she had asthma, which no one else in the family has. That's autoimmune. I have an arthritis that no one else in the family had. That's autoimmune. Then one of the other big problems for women was the infertility that relates in particular to hypothyroidism. If a lot of women did not learn about Hanford's radioiodine until after they'd passed through their childbearing years. I was lucky in that I learned about it while I could still have children. Once I was diagnosed correctly and put on synthetic thyroid medication, I was pregnant right away. Now, a lot of the women, though, had either inability to become pregnant or inability to carry the pregnancy to term. So they had spontaneous abortions or stillborn babies or neonatal deaths. And there was a spike, which means like a real increase of neonatal deaths around Hanford during the late 40s and through the 50s, which is years of very high radioiodine released from the facility. And you can see these baby graves, line after line of identical baby graves in the historic Richland Cemetery and in Pasco, and in two places that had hot spots of radiation, Walla Walla and Spokane, which are two cities in Eastern Washington. So, but that, there's also birth defects. That one of the stories in the book is about a woman who had anophthalmia, which is a lack of no eyes, no ocular nerve. So she couldn't benefit even if she had prosthetic eyes because there's no ocular nerve to support that. And she was convinced that her mother's exposure led to this genetic abnormality. So, because her mother lived right on a farm across from Hanford in the early years of Hanford.
被爆者たちは自身の抱える症状と核施設の影響を主張しています。国や研究機関は幾度も被爆の状況を探る調査を行いました。しかし、原子力委員会は核施設によって一般市民が被爆したことを認めません。原子力委員会は健康に関する影響を知っていたと書かれています。 なぜ彼らは認めることができなかったのだと思われますか？
It's an interesting irony that while the children and people, civilians, were being exposed off-site of Hanford, the government was doing a lot of measuring of how much radiation was being released. They were measuring they were looking at the fish, contamination of fish in the river, the fish that had eaten radioactive moss near the reactors. There were 9 reactors, by the way, a huge number of production reactors. But it was known from the very beginning that there was a great deal of possible danger involved in producing plutonium. And that's the reason that the US government signed contracts with the private contractors who signed up to be nuclear contractors. And those agreements offered complete indemnification of the contractors in case of personal injury lawsuits by exposed people. So they were aware from the beginning that this was going to be dangerous. They also did the studies I mentioned a bit ago at the animal farm on sheep that showed that in 1950, that showed that you could really damage a young animal or a person's thyroid if they were to intake radioactive iodine. There were some amazing, very, very disabled lambs were born after they were exposed to their mothers. They were exposed to the radioiodine their mothers, the ewes, ingested. So that was known. And they were, as I said, measuring the radioactivity in organs of animals in the slaughterhouses. So they knew a whole lot, and they could have done, they could have instituted some very easy and inexpensive public health measures to protect us, which they didn't do. And those were to recommend iodized table salt. If we used iodized table salt, it would block the uptake of radioiodine into people's thyroids, or to have people take every day a non-radioactive iodine tablet. Very simple, inexpensive, but they were worried that if they recommended this, the public would panic because they didn't know there was radiation there, and then they would, and that they would lose their workforce with people leaving the area because they didn't want their children to live there. I would argue that had they offered these simple protective measures, some people would have left, but others would have stayed, and eventually you would have had a workforce that voluntarily assumed the risk of being there in spite of these radionuclides coming out. And they could have all blocked radioiodine uptake with those 2 public health measures. So, it's amazing they didn't. I would argue that they didn't have to hide it from the public, that it would have been humane, compassionate, and reasonable to inform people of what the risk that they were putting their children into by living there.
核施設と被爆による発病の影響を明らかにするために、どのようなものを食べたのか、どの程度川で泳いだことがあるかといったことが裁判では聞かれます。人々はどのように被爆したのか教えてください。
There are quite a few ways. I mentioned some of them, which were through the air, through eating contaminated food, through drinking contaminated water, eating fish from the Columbia that were contaminated, swimming in the river, eating contaminated game. And for people living downriver from Hanford along the Columbia River, a lot of them used water from the river for irrigation of their plants and fed to their animals. So there was radioactive content going into the roots of the plants and being passed into the plants. And also if the animals were grazing on pastures that had been watered with this water, it was problematic. They swam in the river too, so that was exposure. And then the Native Americans, we had, I think, about 7 tribes and nations in the Hanford downwind area. And they had it was shown that because of their more outdoor lifestyle, they were outside more than a lot of the non-Native Americans. Plus, they would eat, hunt and gather berries and various plants as part of their traditional life, and those would be contaminated. In addition, they would eat the whole fish, and so the thyroid of the fish contained a lot of radioactive iodine. And then sometimes you make soup from the fish and boil the bones, which had, I think, strontium 90 in the bones of the fish. I'm not sure of the exact radionuclide, but so their exposures, when you add them up, were quite a bit higher than non-Native Americans. And there were also migrant workers, Hispanic workers working the fields. And because they were outside and using very short hose to hoe the ground, they were in contact with the ground and the contaminants. So I feel that, although I've never seen a study on it, that they probably received higher exposures as well.
トリシャさんのお父さんはエンジニアで、ハンフォードで核兵器を製造するお仕事に就いていた時期があります。法律家になり、お父様のお仕事をいわば否定される活動をしていますが、ご家族の間にどのような葛藤がありましたか？
Even before my father got sick and died of thyroid cancer, I really started working in 1988 on issues pertaining to Hanford, and he really didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want to discuss it. And then when I started getting sick, he just really didn't think it could be possibly related to Hanford in any way. So it really we had a lot of discomfort for that reason in the family. My mother stayed out of it because she didn't want to get in the middle of it. So, and I had other family members working at other nuclear sites because I have a lot of nuclear people in my family. So I got no support from any of them either. So I was pretty much by myself on this. And in 1989, I brought together a big meeting of downwinders in California because I lived there at the time. And a lot of people came. There must have been about 50 people. And one of the plaintiff's attorneys came in Inree Hanford, which was the Hanford downwinder litigation. And everyone talked about their health problems. It was shocking what really some of the diseases that I talked to you about that you could see in these people. And they were pretty desperate. They didn't know quite what to do. So they were really glad to have one of the attorneys there. And a lot of them signed up for the litigation at that time. My parents both came, but my father didn't say a thing. Really interesting. He did attend, but he didn't say anything. So I think he was sort of thinking about it. And then in 1995, at the end of 1995, my father suddenly had like a sore throat. He couldn't swallow, and they had to do emergency surgery, put in the tracheotomy tube I mentioned, and his esophagus and trachea were closed off by thyroid cancer that had metastasized. And he could speak to us if he covered the end of his tracheotomy tube with his fingers, but he refused to do so. To me, that means he was either stubbornly unwilling to talk about how his thyroid cancer might have been related to Hanford. I can't tell because he kind of declined very fast, and pretty soon his mental abilities were not there anymore. So there's no closure on that. I don't know if he'd survived, would he have helped me in my work? I don't know. My mother, however, was very convinced after she saw what happened to my father that Hanford had caused her problems, my problems, and his. But as to my dad, he was just really stubborn to the very end. Yeah, pretty difficult to go through.
被爆者たちと核実験の委託業者の間で繰り広げられた法廷での戦いについて書かれています。結果的に被爆は認められ、被爆者たちは賠償を勝ち取ったのでしょうか？
There is no federal compensation program or medical care available to us. Whereas, which is really hard to admit, but the workers, like my father or my mother, who are both workers, the workers were monitored, and they can receive $150,000 compensation for the same injuries and same cancers as developed in the civilians. So in my family, I had my mother, my father, and myself, and my brother died. He was part of the high incidence of deaths, baby deaths. But we all got thyroid problems, yeah, all three of us, but only my father was able to get compensation for his death by thyroid cancer. My mother died of malignant melanoma, but that's not on the list of recognized radiogenic cancers. So she had to have what's called a dose reconstruction, and it showed her dose wasn't high enough for it to show the link between the fallout and her cancer. For me, because I was a baby at my most vulnerable period of life, ironically, there's nothing to help me. There's no logic to this because I lived in the path of all this fallout too, but there's no help. There was a medical monitoring program recommended by a federal agency in 1997, but the Department of Energy refused to fund it. It was under Superfund law, which is the law that pertains to these massively toxic sites they're trying to clean up. The Department of Energy was responsible for paying for the program if it's recommended that we are monitored. They refused to fund it, so we never got medical monitoring, and we didn't get what's called an exposure subregistry, which would have tracked the other diseases that we are all getting. So we were not helped. We had no monitoring, so it's very hard to see this happening, that the workers are treated with all this like medical care and compensation. The civilians, or sometimes the children of those workers who are also sick, are nothing for them. That's why we filed the personal injury lawsuits. Our litigation for Hanford downwinders followed litigation that the Nevada test site downwinders filed. And I don't want to get into the complexities of their case, but because the result of the Nevada test site downwinders litigation was not positive for the downwinders, even though they originally got a very positive result from the federal judge, it was overturned by the 10th Circuit. So for us, when we tried to file litigation in 1990, a really big experienced personal injury law firm in Seattle didn't want to handle our case because of what had just happened with the Nevada test site downwinders. We did, however, find some very dedicated, talented individual attorneys who are willing to represent us, but they had to pay for because you don't pay any money up front in this type of case, you end up, if you do get an award, you give a percentage to your attorney. That's called contingency. So we didn't have to pay anything. So our attorneys had to support 25 years of litigation. And by the end of the time, they were running out of money. So that influenced the outcome of the case. Whereas at the same time, because of these indemnification agreements I mentioned to you before, where the government indemnified the contractors in case of these types of suits, they had all the money they needed. The defense was fully funded. Like they think they spent $80 million for the defense. Whereas for us, we had to rely on private funds to support our cases. It's a very bad situation, and I feel the law needs to be changed because it was very unfair. The case, as I said, crept along for 25 years. It was the longest civil litigation, at least in Eastern Washington. And it wasn't until 2005, which is like 15 years after the cases were filed, that we finally had representative plaintiffs go to jury trial. We started with 6 representative plaintiffs. They're just randomly selected. 3 had thyroid cancer and 3 had thyroid disease. The 3 with thyroid disease their cases were dismissed because of the level of exposure, couldn't prove the causal link. The 3 thyroid cancer bellwethers continued to trial. There were 2 of them received between them a total of $545,000. That's really high. And this was historic because it's the first time a trial jury had found nuclear contractors liable for injury to people exposed to radioactive fallout from a US nuclear weapons program. The third was a very sad case. And she was actually dying at the time of trial from thyroid cancer that had spread all over her body. But because we all had to rely on reconstructed doses, which are very inexact, just sort of guessing what you ate, guessing what you drank, and having scientists take that information and trying to figure out how much you were exposed to. That's what we had to rely on because our exposures weren't measured at the time like the workers' exposures were. So the third person couldn't prove the causal link between fallout and her thyroid cancer because they said her reconstructed dose was too low. And apparently they didn't take into account the fact she drank raw milk on a farm. Raw milk has higher radioiodine content because it hasn't been processed. So it's only an 8-day half-life for radioiodine. So it was right after it came out of the cow. So she probably got a pretty high dose. But it's all dependent on what reconstructed dose is accepted in the court. And there was a lot of fighting between defense and plaintiffs over what dosage would be accepted for each person, as you can imagine. All 3,500 plaintiffs or something like that when we started, only three out of 3,500 were able to tell their stories to a jury, which is amazing because if they'd heard more of our stories, the public would have known how bad the injuries were from Hanford's fallout. And that's one reason this book is real important because it tells 24 more of these stories. And it shocked people. A lot of people have just said to me, I had no idea that this was happening. These are people who live around Washington. They didn't know. Okay, that I mentioned a little bit here about how much people received. There were a lot of the people didn't want anyone to know how much they received. I guess they were worried that other people would say that they wanted part of the money. I have no idea why, but in 2011, 139 people with hypothyroidism, they're represented by an Oregon attorney, accepted like very small settlements of $5,683 for thyroid cancer. I mean, doesn't even cover, the medication you need to take or the time lost from work. Another attorney got about $6,000 for each client. And then the litigation ended with an undisclosed settlement. So a lot of people got nothing if they didn't have thyroid disease or thyroid cancer, that they had another cancer, or they had thyroid disease or thyroid cancer, but their reconstructed doses weren't high enough to prove the causal link. So they didn't get anything either. So there's a lot of people, a lot of downwinders who got nothing. And this is really not justice. And that's why I feel a federal compensation plan would be much fairer,
日本は2011年に福島原発のメルトダウンがありました。あの事故を報道を通して見たときにどう思いましたか？
Fukushima Daiichi meltdowns in 2011, I immediately knew there'd be exposures to people downwind because you could see the stuff coming out of these reactors as they melted down. And because radioactive iodine is released in nuclear reactor meltdowns, I assumed we'd see thyroid cancer in children once a several-year latency period had passed. And I also feared that, as they did in the US, the government of Japan and TEPCO would deny that these cancers were caused by the exposures downwind of Fukushima Daiichi. So, because that allows them to escape liability for harm. So I'm hoping that the book will help. I hope a lot of people will read it in Japan and that they will lend understanding of what happens when you expose children to fallout. And I think these kids need to be monitored long term because they're going to have other problems as well. You can't just stop monitoring them. You need to, this is the beginning of of the passage of latency periods for other cancers, for more thyroid cancers. So I'm hoping that they will be cared for and monitored, maybe lifetime.